Cormac McCarthy's The Orchard Keeper is a fire novel, but it is one of his most underread and misunderstood novels. And there are going to be no spoilers in the first 3/4 or so of this video. I'll let you know when we move into spoiler land. But I'm just going to say it right now. This novel is a solid 8 on the scale. It's like a Southern Gothic incest 8. It has so many different positive elements, but it is very hard to read for most Cormac McCarthy fans because it is vastly different from all of his other books. And I've seen this common thread on Reddit 1,000 times. Someone will read Blood Meridian or, The Road and be like, I love Cormac McCarthy. This guy was great. So I'm going to go back to his first work and read it. And they go back to The Orchard Keeper and they're like, what the hell is going on here? Because if you are a new reader or someone who isn't, let's say, well rested, you have a kid or a job and you're stressed, or you've just never read anything like it, while you're reading, you're going to be like, wait, someone just died. There was a fight. Did someone just get in a car crash? Have I been reading from the perspective of a cat for 10 pages? Some of these questions you're going to be having in retrospect, like, what is going on? And that's why I created a 10-hour Orchard Keeper course, which is located on the Cormac McCarthy course at cormacmccarthy.substack.com, which is only $5 a month. I also have this dope Orchard Keeper streetwear shirt if you want that. And having read this book about 15 times over the past 8 months while creating all that content, I know what was going through Cormac's head. Cormac was under a lot of pressure during his late 20s. He had an overbearing father and mother who were very successful and judgmental about Cormac's path, as any rich, religious, snooty parents would be. Their son is trying to become an author. His brother was going on to work at the law firm of his father. His sisters went to prestigious colleges and were getting jobs. And here's Cormac, who's still trying to get his undergrad at 27 and 28. And he's telling everyone, I'm going to be this author. Then he has a wife and he's about to have a kid. And of course, as most partners do, his wife wanted stability. She wanted money. And on top of all that, Cormac is this high IQ individual who has a ton of talent. And so all these three things are to create a ton of pressure. And I think Cormac wanted to create this one-hit wonder, this kill shot with The Orchard Keeper that was going to catapult him to fame. Because there was a certain arrogance that McCarthy had when writing this. When he sent it off to Random House and they hit him back up and they're like, yeah, I think we want to publish this, but there's like some major issues in here. And this is coming from some of the top editors in the world. McCarthy said, I've looked over this a million times. There's nothing wrong with this. But eventually they had to make 2 years worth of edits because of how screwed up the timelines, the punctuation, and so many different elements were in it. And McCarthy, in his arrogance or ignorance, whatever we want to call it, I think it was a little bit of both, didn't realize what was exactly going on with the reading population in the country. So The Orchard Keeper has multiple timelines. There are shifts in the middle of chapters from characters that happen without any notice. McCarthy's prose is the most maximalist of his entire career. And a lot of the times he's very vague with what's happening, and certain scenes are written in a very kind of fever dream, stream of consciousness aspect, because I would argue that the book is a recollection of memory of one of the characters. And so it is very postmodernist in its nature. But when you release a very hard book that's postmodernist, you need a couple things on there's only a couple ways that can go right. So for instance, one of the most famous postmodernist kind of maximalist books of all time is Infinite Jest over here. But the marketing plan for Infinite Jest was as such. For about 6 or 7 months before, they started sending out, and this is book publishing companies, letters to people saying, will you be able to solve this book? And they were having this massive campaign about this unreadable book, this unsolvable book that was going to be this crazy thing that only the smartest people could figure out. And it created kind of a frenzy before Infinite Jest even came out. And then when people got the book and it was too hard for them to finish, it just snowballed the effect. They were like playing on that it was hard. Or like kind of on the opposite side, there have been postmodernist novels or things kind of in the same vein as McCarthy, but they were hip, they were cool, they were San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles type novels, and they had kind of a culture surrounding them. This is what we see with the beat movement, with kind of the East Coast postmodernist movement that was happening around this time. But Southern Gothic had been dead for decades, or William Faulkner at this point hadn't released a good novel in about 30 years. Flannery O'Connor was dead. And to make matters worse, when you look at like the original book cover and like back of the book, the description of the novel just makes it seem like it's going to be kind of a southern murder mystery thriller type novel. And then you get into it, and in the first, chapter or two, there's at least 10 to 15 character shifts that if you aren't following closely, you won't know who or what is going on. So despite all of this, The Orchard Keeper is a great novel because is McCarthy with a chip on his shoulder. He is writing in the style that we love with more aggression than usual. He also hasn't kind of gotten into his symbolic phase yet, and he is more overt with a lot of his like symbols. We hear about witch covens and kind of more occult things. And he writes in a more classic Southern Gothic sense. And it's somewhat juvenile, but it's fun because we get to actually see some of the aspects of reality that Cormac enjoys. Their werecats are a big part of the novel. Spirituality and like these types of things have a big presence in this, and that's never really the case. Like in other books, they're like there in fleeting moments, but they're kind of at the core of the story because one of the main themes of this novel is what happens when we push against nature? What happens when the reciprocity with nature is not just broken, but put under the constraints of the technological society? Because a man messing up and him getting consequences, or a sins of the father type scenario, has been common throughout literature for all of time. But there's always a form of repentance or way back, or at least it's offered. But in The Orchard Keeper, and in almost all of McCarthy's works, civilization, technology is this sigmatic wild card that doesn't allow us to come back because there is no way to escape it anymore. And in the prologue of The Orchard Keeper, and this really isn't a spoiler, it's in the first 2 paragraphs, some men are cutting down a tree. 3 men are cutting down a tree. And as they're cutting it down, they hit a gate. And the tree had grown around a gate. And it's this big, it's the first thing Cormac ever wrote. And it's this big symbol that we are now interlaced with civilization and technology. We can't escape it anymore. Even nature has integrated with it. And McCarthy sees this as a negative thing. So in the novel, we deal with 3 characters who are at 3 different phases of their life. We deal with a young 13, 14, 15-year-old named John Wesley Ratner. We deal with a man in his mid-20s named Marion Silder. And then we deal with a man in his late 80s, early 90s named Arthur Ownby. And all of them have a relationship with nature, but all of them have, for lack of a better term, committed sins against nature. And in a typical story, there should be a way back. But Cormac beautifully interlaces technology and the loss of the Appalachian Mountain culture to not give these characters the opportunity for redemption that they need. And so McCarthy was inspired to write this because of his father, who was an attorney for the Tennessee Valley Authority, and his main job was pushing eminent domain on mountain people to get them off their, ancestral and farming, homes. And this has to be traumatizing because you don't want your dad to be that guy. How weird must it be to have to meet some of your peers who are your age or older than you, and your dad was the one who threw them off the land, who came and showed up at court if they wanted to fight it, and kicked their butts and still threw them off their land. All for projects that really didn't need to happen, creating dams, creating national parks, which are just these for-profit enterprises that, front themselves as conservation. But as you see with like Yellowstone or Yosemite now, they don't care about conservation when there's thousands of cars and random tourists, disrespecting the land and the animals. That's not about conservation. It's about control and profit. And people were saying this, from moment one. And, and around Cormac's time, this was a very common idea. In 1968, 5 years after this, Desert Solitaire was released by Edward Abbey. And he, just lashes out into the National Park Service and whatnot. And the changes that happened in a couple decades to the Knoxville kind of region and the county surrounding it were some of the most quick in the whole country. Because from like 1910 to about 1935, when Cormac came, there was a massive influx of factories, of workers, and corporatization to the area. It had been relatively untouched. They didn't have like coal mines, and they weren't dealing with all the union stuff and that was going on with all the other counties, but they did get hit hard with industrialization out of nowhere. And with industrialization comes regulation and eyeballs on the area. When you have a bunch of new people, they're like, oh my God, look at this Great Smoky Mountains National Park, area. We have to preserve this. This is so great. But they don't realize that there's thousands of families who are living out on that land. And they don't really care because they have this elevated view. They view themselves as better than these people who are living out in shanties or on these little farms out there. They can live anywhere else. Look how much other land there is. And so that is kind of the undercurrent of the novel. The characters all have participated in kind of this industrialization of society in various capacities and feel guilty because of that. And their trauma drives them to choices that further their confrontation with modern society, usually through, in the novel, like the police and the government. And with these three characters, I think we're seeing kind of the triune or the trinity of Cormac's mind. The young man, John Wesley Ratner, I think is kind of a reminiscing of Cormac when he was younger, kind of the non-intellectual side, like the wild side of Cormac. The middleman, Marion Silder, is Cormac's fantasies about what he could be. I mean, he's very similar to a lot of the characters in Suttrie's, this kind of criminal type of man. Because McCarthy grew up rich. McCarthy came from a very affluent family, especially in the area, and I think viewed like the boys who were poor Tennessee kids who just ran around the wilderness and hunted, and the men who worked and did illegal things as kind of heroes. And then the biggest hero of all in the novel is the old man, who is, the people that you talk to. Like in 1940, this is crazy. Cormac could have talked to people in his young age who were in the Civil War, who fought in the Civil War if they were old enough. I mean, Arthur Omby, the man in the story, was alive and does remember the Civil War. Cormac could have met former slaves. And obviously people who had been affected by Jim Crow laws and whatnot. And then most of the other people around him knew people who fought in the Civil War, were like direct descendants of people who were slaves, or, it was a whole different group of people. And these people were dying, though. These people were dying, and their stories and their culture were being lost. And this is actually a huge restoration project that's going on now. And people are trying to reclaim a lot of these Appalachian stories and projects. Songs and art that, just got swept away in a couple decades because of this industrialization. And so I think Cormac really captures the essence of Knoxville, where he's from, in this novel, even more so than a lot of his other works, because in Suttree, you're in Knoxville. And even though Cormac lived in Knoxville proper for, I think, a little bit when he was at the University of Tennessee, he lived south of Knoxville in Blount and Sevier County for his entire time there. And so that's where his heart really is. Outer Dark and Child of God, they take place north of Knoxville. So where Cormac grew up is the Orchard Keeper. In this novel, it's all around his house, like Red Mountain, where the orchard's at. It's all within walking distance of his house, and he had been to all these different places multiple times. And that's why you see it's like a very descriptive novel, and a lot of the nature scenes are just very magical. There's something about them that doesn't have the minimalistic elements of Child of God, Outer Dark, and at some level Suttree in terms of like the nature descriptions. It doesn't feel as disconnected. Another thing I really like about this novel is it has some of the more actionable and overt messaging of any of McCarthy's novels. And the main theme is obviously everything we've been talking about. Like, all this stuff is bad, blah, blah, blah. But McCarthy isn't like outright saying it, but he has these lines. And when I was studying the drafting process and the early drafts of The Orchard Keeper, he was much more aggressive with a lot of this. And a lot of this was kind of out there, and he was making connections. And as usual, McCarthy made it more vague as we got closer, he went through each draft. But he really was trying to make a statement here. He was trying to make a statement to his father, to everyone around them, that what they were doing was wrong, that there was something more here. And it's that childhood innocence, it's that boyhood utopian mindset that really comes forth in this novel that I think is just endearing, especially if you're a fan of Cormac, because he is an artist. I mean, he is a Cancer in terms of astrology. He does have these kind of emotions and these sympathies, as we see in The Road and The Crossing, and most of the time we just have to deal with it ourselves. But in The Orchard Keeper, we get a little bit more resolution than usual. So I actually won't spoil anything. I don't think I've spoiled anything too major. And so the link to The Orchard Keeper is down below. The link to my course is also down below if you're interested in that. I mean, if you read The Orchard Keeper and signed up for a month, you could get all the content. I'm pretty sure a lot of it is all downloadable too. So even when you're not a member, you can just keep working your way through all the content. And I take so many different angles. Like I deep dive into all this. If you like, the history of all this, what it all means, like a lot of the spirituality elements, like we go on these multiple hour deep dives into all of that. And then, we study his writing style, how he was forming sentences. There's like a whole bunch of stuff. Go look at all of it. And if you're interested, sign up and I will see you in there. Peace.